Welcome to the Changing Perspectives on Mature and Old Growth in the Tongass National Forest webinar. My name is Miranda Hom, and I'm the Tongass Forest Program Manager with Southeast Alaska Conservation Council. I'm excited to be here today in partnership with Environment America and Alaska Wilderness League. So today we will be doing a panel style presentation. So you'll hear from myself, our additional speaker and selected panelists first, then we'll go through RSVP questions. Next slide. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian peoples as the original stewards of these lands in what is known as the Tongass National Forest today. Next slide. I'm happy to be joined here today with our panelists, Mita DeWitt, Dr. Dominic De La Sala, and Kellen Nelson. Mita is the Imago Initiative Coordinator and Senior Specialist for the Wilderness Society's Alaska region. Mita focuses on a multifaceted approach to achieving holistic, broad-spectrum movement building. Mita's work revolves around the personal credo, leave a world that can support life in a culture worth living for. Her experience draws from her trainings as an Alaska Native traditional healer and healthy Native communities capacity building facilitator. Dr. Dominic De La Sala is the Chief Scientist at Wild Heritage and former President of the Society for Conservation Biology, North America section. He is an internationally renowned author of over 300 science papers on forest and fire ecology, conservation biology, endangered species management, and climate change, including his edited book, Temperate and Boreal Rainforests of the World, Ecology and Conservation. Dominic is motivated by his work to leave a living planet for his daughters and grandkids and all those that follow. Kellen Nelson serves as a research forester for the USDA Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station in Juneau, Alaska. His work spans forest ecology and silviculture topics across Alaska and Western US. It's great to have you all here today. Next slide. I will now turn it over to Meredith Trainer, the Executive Director with Southeast Alaska Conservation Council. She'll be covering a bit of the history and current issues that we are seeing firsthand as we continue to learn more about mature and old growth forests and how they provide for deer, salmon, and climate benefits.
Thanks, Miranda. Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. I wanted to talk a little bit today about the history of the Tongass and the way it factors into our conversation here about the executive order this past spring and what it means for Southeast Alaska. Many folks know that in the 1950s, there was wide-scale clear-cut logging of the Tongass National Forest. What many may not think about, unless you were here for it at that time, is that many of the places that got logged first were the most valuable locations in the Tongass. Either the sites that were being logged had really great site attributes in terms of they had really good light, they had really good water, they had really optimal soils, or they were really accessible. They were very close to rivers originally, and then later on to roads. That clear-cut logging expanded across the Tongass. As it grew over time, more and more of our landscape ended up being clear cut to the point that communities pushed back and groups like the Southeast Alaska Conservation Council were formed to put some downward pressure on that extensive logging in our region. We often think about the importance of protecting the remaining old growth forests. Those are the oldest forests, the most intact forests that have never been logged before in the Tongass. And that's definitely true. It's definitely a priority for us at SEAC, and it's a priority for all of us in Southeast Alaska. But one of the things that we sometimes overlook is the importance of protecting second growth, protecting the forest that's regenerating as it begins to mature and as it approaches the same characteristics that we think of when we think of old growth. If you live in the Tongass or you've walked through the Tongass through an old growth part of the forest, you know what I'm talking about. You know how spacious and yet covered the forest feels. You know what the vegetation looks like. You know that there's forage species along the bottom. not necessarily so densely that you can't move through the area, but definitely available for deer and available for those of us who want to eat berries as we make our way through the woods. Protecting those mature forest locations, those areas where the forest has regenerated and where it's grown back over time, and especially the oldest of those mature forest locations, is a key part of the discussion that we're going to have today. As we think about how a forest regenerates, each of those mature forest areas, those that are starting to get to be the oldest of what's been cut before, are critically important to us, including in a climate and a carbon context. The older those areas get, the more not just the trees themselves, but the soil underneath start to resemble old growth and deliver us some of the same climate benefits that we see from old growth forests. So I know that a lot of people think of SEAC as synonymous with protecting old growth, and certainly we hope we are. But increasingly we're looking today, and we'll be talking in this conversation today about protecting those mature forests, the oldest of the regeneration, and also defining what it is that we're actually talking about when we talk about mature forests and old growth. Those carbon climate values that President Biden gave us tools to explore and to support and protect really need to be fleshed out and made specific. And I know Miranda and the group of panelists assembled here today are going to talk a little bit more about that. So Miranda, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. All right, next slide. I'm going to give a quick overview of what's been happening on the national level with some of our federal forest land before we dive into the specifics of the Tongass with our experts. All right, on April 22nd, President Biden signs Earth Day executive order directing federal agencies to define and conduct an inventory of mature and old growth forests on federal lands and develop policy. This is not a rule or a law. We still need something durable, but it's a good start. The biggest deal, the EO talks about mature and old growth forests as climate smart stewardship and management, which is something we haven't seen before. Our next quote slide. Now turning it over to our RSVP questions and the experts. Tell us, how do you see people's perspectives on mature and old growth changing in your field?
Well, perhaps I will jump in and speak first. So my name is Kellen Nelson, and I'm a research scientist, which means that I'm responsible for generating new knowledge related to forest ecology and providing information on related to that area expertise. It's important to note that I'm not directly involved in the land management decision-making process. I do sit within the Forest Service, but my role is primarily in knowledge generation. I think one important thing that my field has acknowledged is that, and this is pertinent to the Tongass, that we have widespread primary forests up here in the Tongass, and this includes lands that are not only old growth, but fit other designations as well. Even small diameter forests can be old growth and can be old, yet small in stature. So one issue that my field has identified since the early conceptualizations of old growth in the 80s and 90s is that the historic idea of old growth assumes that forest development is linear and that it culminates in a predictable condition that's stable and self-perpetuating through time. This idea of old growth places the highest value on this final late seral state, but it disregards the journey that forests undergo as they develop into that old growth forest state. For the forest ecologist, this conceptualization ignores the reality that ecosystems are dynamic in time and space. Ecosystems are constantly responding to frequent and infrequent events, and those events occur at fine and broad geographic extents. At any point in time, somewhere on the landscape, a forest stand is being disturbed, forest stand is undergoing rejuvenation, a forest stand is reaching middle age, and a forest stand is becoming decadent. This is all due to natural processes, and this is natural forest development. So many scientists in the forest ecology field would like to see acknowledgement moving forward in policy with regard to old growth, acknowledging that mature and old growth forests are dynamic. And by treating them as stationary, as we have done in the past, we do not build flexibility into our management approaches that might be necessary in an unknown future, especially under climate change.
Thank you, Kellen. I'm just going to springboard off of that because from an indigenous perspective, each forest is different, and we know that the Joshua forests are hundreds of years old, and the sequoias are several hundreds of years old, and we have the definitions that are now saying mature old growth are 80 years old or so forth. And it's good to have guidelines, but it's also important to remember that not all forests are the same. So kind of viewing down into the Tongass National Forest, as a Tlingit person, Shinga Ani, we've been in relationship with these forests for tens of thousands of years. And so the concept of old growth versus new growth is actually one that came in with colonization and logging, mass clear-cut logging, because that didn't actually happen pre-contact. There were fire events, but the management of the forest was intentional to reduce large fire events with intentional burning or clearing of spaces, especially to open up berry patches, as you mentioned earlier, Meredith, or different ways to steward the space to increase the abundance that's available. And it's interesting because I heard an elder say that when they were first hearing about logging on their island, they were told that the forest would regrow in 50 years. And that's what they were told. And now we know it takes closer to 100 years even to just get started, right? And then you get those complex relationships and biodynamics that happen in the forest, which can take even longer. So I think that the evolving sense of what old growth is more about seeing natural systems as sentient, living, complex beings and helping them to be the healthiest viable possibility. In that process, we benefit, the environment benefits, the plants and animals benefit. And so I'm thankful that we're moving in this direction.
All right, and moving right into our second question.
I didn't go yet, though. You trying to cut me off. I don't know if this is the second question, but I do want to share my perspective of being on the Tongass now for over 30 years. And it's where I kind of cut my intellectual teeth, so to speak, when I was a research fellow working on some of the first old growth bird studies on the Tongass on Prince of Wales Island. And for those of you that know the island, and I'm sure there are many, I was there before there was a highway on POW. So getting around, on those dirt roads was quite the ordeal. But anyway, I have been blessed with a career that takes me to the most important places on the planet, whether they're tropical or temperate rainforests. It's just been an amazing BioBlitz that I've been on for the last 30 years. And what I have been able to identify, mostly with the book that came out in 2011, I was mentioned before, is the Tongass, together with the sister neighbors to the south, the Great Bear, represents about a quarter of the world's temperate rainforest. That's extraordinary, an extraordinary concentration that's found in only a couple of places on the planet. So you already have global significance in addition to the Great Bear as representing the world's largest tract of old growth temperate rainforest. And over the years, what we've been able to identify is the amount of old growth on the Tongass is over 5 million acres of productive old growth, as the Forest Service calls it. That is tops in the nation. And also the roadless areas, the inventory roadless areas, 9.3 million acres of inventory roadless areas, representing 16% of the nation's total inventory roadless areas. But the more recent discovery was in carbon. And we started to take a look at that only about a decade ago. finding that when you add up all the carbon in the Tongass rainforest, the carbon in that single national forest is representing 20% of all the carbon on the national forest system. So when we start to think about climate refuges and places that can be carbon sinks and carbon reservoirs, there's no place like the Tongass in the national forest system that has as much carbon that can help with climate change. And we're seeing some drastic changes to the interior of Alaska, which is the highest climate velocity on the planet. The Tongass is relatively insulated compared to the interior of Alaska and points further south in the rainforest coastal region of the Pacific Northwest. So it's really important that you kind of shine an international and a global spotlight on the area. And I think, you know, the transition has been underway since the Obama administration. So we're hoping that the Tongass National Forest continues to move in that direction. There's no need to manage mature and old growth forests. They are dynamic systems, but they do best when there's not chainsaws in them. There are some exceptions, point south, in terms of what we're seeking to protect mature forest in the lower 48 that may need some small diameter thinning in the dry forest. But for the most part, you've got a pretty intact system up there. The restoration is needed mostly in the areas that have been heavily logged, but not in the mature and old growth forests. Those are dynamic, but they're going to do their thing, and we need them to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and provide all their benefits, including the traditional cultural values for the indigenous people. And so I guess that one thing that we would like to see in the groups that I work with, the coalitions that work on this issue following the president's executive order, is a national rulemaking that protects all the nation's mature and old growth forests. We could talk about that later, how do you define that? But we've done some mapping, we have a good handle on it. We know what mature is, we know what old growth is. The Tongass can lead the way to national rulemaking because the transition is underway, and that's, you know, the direction that we hope the rest of the nation will take.
And just as you were saying, Dominic, defining that, our next question is, how can the intrinsic value of older forests be included in their definition? What characteristics distinguish young growth, mature forests, and old growth?
Well, I guess I could take a stab at this, if I may, because I've been involved in these studies now for some years. I mentioned my work on the Tongass in the 90s. That included young and, well, young generated by clear cuts and old growth. The Tongass is pretty unique in that it doesn't really have, to this point, a mature age class per se, because most of the logging took place under the 50-year contracts. And so the stands that have been logged previously that have now reforested are kind of in the 50 to 70 or less age bracket. And so when you start to think about mature, you're thinking about the forests that are older than 70, maybe around 80 or so. And there's not many of them on the Tongass except from natural blowdown or, you know, slide events. But in the lower 48 states, this is critical because there's so little old growth left in the lower 48. We really got to get a handle on what mature is. We pretty much know what old growth is. The debate centers now on mature, which is the study that we just released a couple of weeks ago that used satellite imagery, three-dimensional imagery, laser technology, pulses shining down on the Earth's surface, sending us back three-dimensional images of trees, so that we could see the height, the canopy, how much biomass they have in them. And we published the first national definition and inventory of mature and old growth forest. Again, I don't want to get into the specifics, I don't have a lot of time, but we pretty much have a good handle on that. We see those characteristics emerging in forests that are about 80 years and above in the lower 48. And foresters know about the term cumulative mean annual increment. As trees grow, they begin to slow down their diameter and their height, and they're mature. And it's a forester's term, and that could be used as well. And in many situations, those are trees around 80 years. It varies depending on the site index, but that's a pretty good baseline for a national rulemaking to get the mature as well as the old growth.
I'm happy to jump in on this topic really briefly. The Tongass is a specific set of criteria that they're using to define old growth as part of this inventory making process. And this stems back to a document from 1992. I have it on my desk, Ecological Definitions of Old Growth Forests in the Alaska region by Jerry Botten. And these criteria include the number of large and decadent trees per acre, the number of snags per acre, the number of canopy layers and diameter classes in the stand, the amount of dead woody material, and the amount of understory plant material. And so you can look up the criteria. There's specific criteria for different site conditions and different forest types listed. There's a very nice matrix that summarizes that, and that is going to be the foundation for what defines old growth. I think there was a question innate to this that was asking what second growth is, and second growth is generally a stand that's undergone a stand replacing disturbance. This could be a stand replacing fire, which we don't see very frequently on the Tongass, but it could also be clear-cut logging. And after these stand initiation events, you have an even age stand that comes up, and so those trees grow as a cohort. They're generally very similar in diameter and tree characteristics. As those stands are young, starting about 15 to 25 years in our region, they're very dense condition, and they exclude a lot of understory plants and understory biodiversity. But with time, those trees compete with one another, and some of them become dominant and some of them get excluded because they're weaker. And so you see a lower and lower density with time as trees fall out of the canopy. With this time, through this time, we tend to get variability in our stands. We get variation in the spacing of the trees. We get openings that form that allow different cohorts of trees to come in. And so mature and old growth stands tend to have higher numbers of different stand layers, multiple generations, multiple ages of trees, a lot of diversity in the stems and in the biodiversity there. To get to the intrinsic value and building intrinsic values into definitions, it's really difficult from a scientist's point of view, and for defining these sorts of things, it's really important that definitions are reproducible and that they meet the test of peer scientist review, so review from other scientists, so that everyone can do things the same way. And one challenge with values is that they're difficult to build definitions around, because my values may not reflect someone else's values. And that's the heart of many of these discussions, right? How do we gauge how majestic a forest is? It's easy enough to count the number of large trees or the number of cohorts or how many canopy layers are in the trees. We go out and inventory it, we can put a number on those sorts of things so we can create criteria. But one person's quality of what is a majestic forest and what's not a majestic forest, some people may find only the forest stands with the biggest trees to be majestic, but I might walk out on a muskeg with a lot of shore pine, and I might think, man, this is a terrific landscape. I'm walking on this amazing peatland with a lot of biodiversity, but it may not qualify under some of the constraints of these rulemaking processes. So that's why things like intrinsic values, majestic value, it's really difficult to build those into definitions, because everyone sees things a little bit differently. This is really the arena of policy and decision-making in applying those values to definitions that are reproducible.
I was just kind of listening and thinking about it, and I really appreciate Kellen and Dom for everything that you're bringing to this conversation. I love reading the scientific aspects of it and pairing it with the cultural aspects. And I was just thinking about intrinsic value and really kind of letting myself kind of feel into that concept. And what I came to was, we have to, keep check on ourselves as human beings and how we value things. That forest is a living entity. The trees are living beings. There's, plants and animals that are living beings, and they have the inherent right to live and to live well. And their intrinsic value is beyond what we as humans value that space, because it's our relatives. That's, you know, the indigenous perspective. And whether it's a young forest that's trying to reestablish itself, whether it's an older forest that hasn't had people in it in a long time, that value is inherent. And, you know, we start getting into that rights of nature, and Mother Earth, and the destruction that's occurred thus far by clear cutting. If we look at it as we're part of the space, then it changes how the values happen. You know, when you're looking at communication between the trees and the different mycelial growth and how they nurture and share nutrients, it mimics our family systems and our food sharing systems that we have traditionally. So that value is that same value that we put on life for each other is in that space.
I really appreciate that perspective. When we were talking during the preparation for this panel, it came to my mind, that an expansive inventory of old growth comes with both benefits and a little bit of risk involved as well. For example, where the conservation community might see a map of lands to protect, businesses and corporations might see a map of natural resource commodities, and local communities might see national interests taking opportunities away that once provisioned their communities. So one question that I have for the panelists, I'm interested in what your view is of the risk of having an inventory like this versus the benefit of the inventory.
Yeah, I guess I could jump in there because I've been really big at pushing the inventory and the request for a national rulemaking, which is where the public would weigh in on all of this, by the way. It's, you know, the rulemaking process would be similar to agency scoping with everyone involved, especially the indigenous community and the indigenous traditional values that are important in this too. And I think, you know, perspectives do matter, of course, in all of this. And when you step back and you look at where you're living, it's so globally unique. And it's unique because of a reason, because the rest of the world has been so heavily logged. There are so few places left around the planet that we can still call primary forest. Now, of course, they have indigenous people in them. And, you know, the president spoke on Earth Day and has spoken before, signed the global declaration to end deforestation and forest degradation by 2030 for a good reason. I mean, we're losing somewhere in the neighborhood of 18, the equivalent of 18 soccer fields of forest every minute of every day, mostly in the tropics. A lot of the temperate has already been entered and degraded and converted to plantations. So you're sitting on an incredible, important area for climate, biodiversity, wildlife species, indigenous values that you've got to kind of take a step back and see how important it is. And I worry more about the risk of not doing action, to be honest. And thank you for that question, Kellen. But, you know, the coalition that I work with, the Climate Forest Coalition, has released an early draft of a report called Threatened Forest that identified 18 timber sales or so in mature and old growth forest around the country. There's a second draft coming out that's going to expand on that. We're having a hard time keeping track of how many projects are in mature and old growth forest on federal lands that are scheduled for logging. I've visited several of them, and I'm just blown away by how the agencies are ignoring the importance of the executive order, which is supposed to lead to conservation. It hasn't yet. And in the meantime, we're seeing old growth sales, mature timber sales going forward, mostly in the lower 48. Maybe they could take a lesson from the Tongass and transition, and the lesson from the Siuslaw National Forest that transitioned during the height of the spotted owl wars, and move out of that and just recognize how unique the system is that you live in and the values there that are so important to everyone, especially in a rapidly changing climate and a world that is shrinking because we have fewer and fewer natural areas.
Yeah, thank you, Dom. And I'll just kind of jump in there. I have two perspectives to share. One is from the Wilderness Society and our forest team. And the Wilderness Society is excited and very supportive of the mapping and creating this, understanding of what do we have here, because it is actually, the data is there for the lower 48, but we don't have that same data to work with up in here in Alaska, especially not with the Tongass. So that inventory is going to be really important to be able to protect those spaces and also work with the community to understand, create a framework of how valuable the space is. And then on the other side, that what I bring to the table is as a Tlingit person, behind me, I have a picture of my son who just danced the Chief Sheikh's flotilla robe. And it was an honor to do that. And our culture goes beyond just regalia, our song, our dances. It goes into who are we as an Indigenous people. And that stewardship, it didn't happen just from the plank house. People walked the land. There was an inventory that was taken on a regular basis. The hunters would bring back information, the gatherers would bring back information. There were stewards of specific spaces, and their entire job was to collect data and information and create that inventory. And then when it came time to find the right tree to make a canoe, they knew which tree to use. That would be the most appropriate, not just for its shape, but because of the space around it as well. There is, very intentional data and information collected for our basket weavers, because you're pulling cedar bark and you can't pull too much from one tree because you want that tree to be able to be viable and to continue to grow. So I'm very supportive of creating an inventory and using that in this process of establishing these spaces and their importance and protecting them for all of our generations.
Yeah, if I could just jump in with one really quick follow-up point. Thank you for that. I think there's such an important role for combining traditional ecological knowledge with Western science knowledge on this. We could both benefit from each other. I will also footnote that there are 3 studies that have come out recently that pertain to the inventory on the Tongass that could be very helpful here. One is a paper that we published, I think it was in the journal Land, that did an inventory of Tongass old growth and the carbon stored in those forests. That was all spatially explicit. All the data sets are available for the inventory going forward. Carol Vine and Bev Law and Associates did a study before that recognized the importance of the Tongass, and the inventory in those data sets is available. And back in 2015, we did a study that looked at simulating climate change on the Tongass relative to the lower 48 and the interior of Alaska, identifying areas that could potentially function as climate sanctuaries as the rest of the planet and the interior heat up. So those data sets are out there to pull from, in addition to what the Forest Service and the PNW Research Station has. This isn't necessarily rocket science, and it shouldn't take a long time, because if we get bogged down in definitions, policy goes nowhere.
Yeah, well, I think it's time to hand back to the moderator, but one final thing I'd like to add that I appreciate about an inventory is that it's full disclosure, and it really puts everyone on the same playing field to have this sort of information publicly available, and to be able to have Dom's information that he's been able to produce through his career, in addition to what will be produced in this executive order. I think it's really nice for equity, for everyone to have a pool of information to make the best decision for our federal lands.
Thank you all. For our next question will be, what considerations around Indigenous sovereignty and historic injustices against Alaska Natives, especially in the form of land takings, factor into our ability or inability to protect our mature and old growth forests today?
That's a lot to process. I was just wanting to take a minute to be able to answer in a good way. Alaska's different than the lower 48. We all have different relationships. And so it's not better than or worse than, it just is. And in our state, people don't realize that we don't actually have reservations. We have one reservation, which the local people actually like to refer to it as a reserve, and that's Metlakatla with our Tsimshian people. But the rest of our state is heavily defined by regulations. We have, over 60%, I think it's close to 65% of federal lands. We have corporate lands, native corporate lands. We have village corporate lands. We have tribal lands. We have private lands. Then you get into municipalities. We have state lands. And there's rules, heavy rules and regulation around how we can use or engage with our traditional lands. And these are steeped, if you go back into history and you look at ANCSA and that removal of Aboriginal title, that concept of Aboriginal title was coined in the Teton versus the United States case. And that they found that judge, my great uncle William Paul, the judge that he was going against, they found out later was a Grand Dragon in the KKK. And so that language that was in place was intentional for cultural and indigenous, basically. It's racist, and I hate to say it, but it's a genocidal process to define and remove and use bureaucracy to separate people from a space. In Alaska, our peoples were taken to boarding schools up until 1972. Molly Hooch went up against the U.S. Supreme Court for the right to stay home in her land and her community. We didn't even have Religious Freedom Act until 1978 for Alaska Native and American Indian peoples. The right to vote was won in 1924 by Chief Shakes, which that robe I just referred to behind me, that was Chief Shakes the Seventh Charlie Jones, who was a civil rights advocate, and he went and voted illegally, and William Paul represented him in court to gain the right to vote for Alaska Native peoples. So these Indian laws that we worked through, that Teton versus the U.S. government, some of those decisions were based on the Marshall Trilogy. And the U.S. Supreme Court, that Marshall Trilogy actually used in the 1800s, the Pappas Bull and the Doctrine of Discovery as some of their foundational base language. And so it's at its root, at its core, it's meant to create otherness. And if you look at those old Pappas Bulls, it says non-Christian people are not human, and they can be used as slave labor or murdered without repercussions, and you can take their lands and resources without repercussions. So when we look at these policies and we're intentionally adding language back in that recognizes Indigenous people, we're undoing hundreds of years of colonial genocide, and we're trying to rematriate and repair those relationships, because the federal government and the American Indians and Alaska Natives are supposed to have a nation-to-nation relationships, and many treaties that were broken, promises that were broken. And so we're in this to repair those relationships as good relatives so we can move forward. And that's part of the impetus for climate change our elders talk about, is that consumption is actually like a spiritual sickness, not having enough or just wanting to increase wealth as for wealth's sake. That's a spiritual sickness. So when we're looking at that repair of Indigenous people and making them whole is bringing them back into that space to have relationship. And one of the things that we're going to have to look at pretty intensely is fixing in ANCSA that Aboriginal title, bringing that back. That's we can still have Aboriginal title and then be simple title with the feds and shared spaces. If we're looking at ANILCA, it says, you can only have this much conservation of acreage in the state, no more than. How about we revisit some of these and adjust them so that they're fair and equitable and that they benefit all of our peoples in the state?
Thanks, Mita. Anyone else before I move on to our next question?
I don't have a lot to add. I think that this is a good position to listen and to hear. And my hope is that Alaska Native communities are being consulted, heard, and provisioned for in conservation and land management plans and decisions moving forward. So thank you for sharing that.
Then sheesh.
And I support what Kellen just said. And I know that when the Trump administration reversed the roadless rule, there was very little consultation with the indigenous community. And if we did go forward with national rulemaking, we would do, at least the coalitions that I work with, everything that we could possibly do to ensure that there's proper tribal consultation on rulemaking going forward, because there wasn't when Trump lifted the roadless protections.
Alrighty, for sake of time, we'll move on to our next question. What kind of new partnerships or collaborative work do you see in the future for protecting mature and old growth forests?
Pretty quiet, so I'm just going to jump in here. The Imago Initiative is one that we're working on at the Wilderness Society, and that's indigenizing conservation. And we're using traditional facilitation methods, cultural methods to bring together federal partners and conservation partners and indigenous tribal partners to the table to vision a future together. We know that we need to steward this land. We know that climate change is here and it's advancing faster than anybody anticipated. And so when we're working together, that's going to create the highest and strongest manifestation of conservation as we move forward. So that's what we've been working on for 3 years now. And of course, SEAC is one of our partners, and we have a lot of great partners that come to the table. And we're thankful for the secretarial orders and the executive orders, from Biden and from Holland, but wanting to see these actually move into law, right, which will require an act of Congress. So what does that look like? Listening to our indigenous partners and, like I said, all of our communities, and bringing that to the table as a group so we can move forward and make sure that this effort that's being put forward now is then ensured for generations to come, not just administrations to come, but generations to come.
I'd like to jump in on this too. I've been at it now, I don't know, 30 or 40 years. So I have kind of this arc of history in terms of the conservation interest in the National Forest. And I would love it if the Forest Service were just willing to grab onto this executive order. And if we do get national rulemaking, to be a partner, to be a leader in changing the paradigm on the National Forest System, and also the BLM for that matter. The rule pertains to both agencies, by the way. And because I can look back in history, I remember back in the 1990s, the Rescissions Act was passed, and that launched or let in a whole bunch of really nasty timber sales that damaged old growth forest in the Pacific Northwest. And a number of us just went to town on that. And we leaned into the Clinton administration and said, this is not good. And a lot of these sales are happening in roadless areas. We want you to do a moratorium on any road building in these roadless areas as you go forward with, fixing this problem. And then a couple of years later, we got the roadless conservation rule. And the Forest Service had leadership in place to embrace that. Mike Dombach, Chris Wood, Jim Furnish, those folks that led the way for the agency to change and to adapt to the new system that is in place. You know, in this case, it's climate change. And these are our older forests are natural climate solutions. They are the most effective climate solutions in the terrestrial sector in the world. And it would really be great if the Forest Service were to embrace their responsible role in maintaining natural climate solutions and grabbing onto this executive order, and if there is national rulemaking, and actually showing some leadership. And the Tongass could really lead in this regard, because you got a jump start on transition. And, you know, it was derailed by the Trump administration, but it was put back in place, and we should be supporting that as a learning laboratory for the rest of the federal lands to do the same thing.
And coming up on our last question, what are you most excited about for the future of the Tongass?
Oh,
Well,
boy.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
yeah, sure. I'll start out and I'll just add a couple perspectives from the last question and follow into this final question. And, you know, what I look forward to is new collaborations and partnerships that'll help me learn about old growth. And I really look forward to digging into the ecology and the management regimes. This is something for someone in my generation. You know, there hasn't been a lot of energy put into old growth in the last decade or so. And so I see this as a really neat opportunity to get involved, to learn what's new and see how I can bring science forward. I'm also interested in thinking about second growth forests. And from where I stand, I see the second growth forest as perhaps the best place to do some of the intensive management that will sustain our communities up here. And if we embrace that and we start doing sustainable management on our second growth forests, as is currently planned and laid out, it's really going to be important to maximize the amount of mature and old growth that is able to be left in reserve status. And it's going to provide a lot of opportunities to our communities in Southeast Alaska. So moving forward into the future, you know, the Tongass is a really unique place in today's world where the legacies of historic land management haven't really completely shifted the landscape away from historic patterns, and climate regimes up here have not become unrecognizable over people's lifetimes yet. I know things are anticipated to change with regard to climate. So I get the sense that we're in a really great opportunity on the Tongass to think ahead, to be ahead of the curve. In other places in the lower 48, for example, we're dealing with the management legacies of the last 150 or more years. And that's put us in the backseat responding to problem after problem after problem. And it's really unique to be in the situation we have here on the Tongass, where we can look ahead, we can design our landscapes the way we want them. We can design how natural resources are managed and how the landscape looks. So yeah, I'm excited about continuing this conversation moving forward as well. And I really appreciate joining the panel today.
Well, I think it's an excellent question. And, you know, because I was able to go back in time, I guess I'll go back to the future, so to speak, now. And just try to cover the gamut of this was then, that this is now, and this is the future, so to speak. And, you know, you got to look at where you've come from. And the heyday of logging old growth on the Tongass is over. And there's residual legacy blowback from that. But I think even the industry recognizes that they can't be logging old growth like they were, certainly, and not even like they were under the Obama administration. Things have changed. And so being adaptable and robust, and what we've seen, the lessons learned in the lower 48 is the industries that have moved on, that have transitioned their milling infrastructure to take small logs. And I totally support what you're saying, Kellen, because I think that's the way to go. on a smaller logging footprint that maintains the values that are really important on the Tongass, and also provides for some local jobs, keeping the lumber local instead of sending, you know, up to 50% of it overseas. So there's an opportunity there to do value added, support communities that are trying to make that transition to second growth. And the Tongass, again, can be in the spotlight and leadership. And I do think it's exciting that, you know, the discussions underway with the traditional values with the indigenous population. It's about time. We all recognize that there's a lot of ground that we need to make, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to work to be working together. And the last thing I'll say is, looking forward, it was really a good learning experience for me to publish that paper in 2015 that we did using climate change downscaled projections. We recognized that the Tongass would be relatively less impacted by climate change compared to the rest of the coastal rainforest further south, like down in the redwood zone, which I also work in, that is potentially going to shift into a subtropical vegetation climate by the end of the century. Imagine that. You don't really have that problem. However, I will say this. When I went up to the Prince of Wales Island 2 years ago, I think it was, when I took the Washington Post up there, they did this wonderful story. You've all seen the story that Julia Dalpine did on how much is an old growth Sitka spruce worth. We went up there. It was 121 degrees in my town of Talent, Oregon. And I thought I was going to go into air conditioning. I flew into Prince of Wales Island. It was 84 degrees. And the native people there were complaining about the salmon weren't running the streams, the deer weren't as abundant, and, you know, everybody's suffering over this. And yeah, the climate models show your regions in better shape theoretically, but I think that you're starting to see some of those effects. And yellow cedar, for example, is been impacted by the loss of snow cover in late spring. And the salmon don't come in when the ambient temperature is above 80 degrees. And this is the future. And we've got to figure out a way to pull more carbon out of the atmosphere, keep it in the forest, and get the heck off of fossil fuels. Otherwise, we're all going to be suffering. And I totally agree in a respectful way with the indigenous views about multi-generational thinking. I'm a granddad, and I'm still looking at the glass half full. And I've got grandkids to watch out for as well. So the next generation is going to be really what this is about.
Thank you, Dom. That's actually where I was thinking of just starting with my words. So that's a great transition. So I'm just going to jump in. What am I excited and hopeful about? I'm excited and hopeful about our kids being able to be in the forest and to pick berries and to see the awe and wonder of nature and inspire that love and curiosity. I also know that the reality of climate change is going to impact all of us as people and our relatives, you know, human and non-human. But I am hopeful because this is the kind of work that's going to help us make it through it and help our non-human relatives make it through it. And I don't want to, you know, use a Pollyanna lens because it is going to be hard. There's a lot to clean up. You know, there's a lot of destruction and carbon and things that have happened that basically it, you know, took from the future to have that richness of industrialization. And so now we have to make up for that effort to balance out those energies. And our elders, they have all told these stories about what's going to happen of an imbalanced relationship with nature. And they've been saying this, you know, for a couple hundred years now, that it's going to require us coming back into balance with our human relatives, our natural relatives, and working together, which in a traditional sense, that's actually how you build, you know, a happier community and happier people and better systems that are abundant, is by that co-creation. So I'm looking forward to regenerative economies, regenerative energy, you know, and these natural systems being able to benefit for themselves as well. as for the humans.
Gunesh, Chish, Mita, and Dominic and Kellen for joining us today. We're just about out of time. Before we wrap up, I'd like to give just a quick update on the formal action of the roadless rule, which is expected November 2022. SEAC will be sharing updates as soon as we have them, so please subscribe to our email. You can also find us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Who knew? So Gunesh Chish to everyone, and thank you all to our panelists and all of you joining us today.
Yechayati.
Thank you, Gunashish.
Thank you.
Bye all.